What happens when a single moment of human weakness destroys centuries of tradition? When the most disciplined soldiers in the world break their sacred oath on camera for the entire world to see. In the digital age, nothing stays hidden. A smartphone in the wrong hands can topple governments, destroy careers, and shatter reputations built over lifetimes. But sometimes, that same technology captures something so extraordinary, so unexpected, that it changes everything we thought we knew about honor, duty, and what it truly means to serve. This is the story of Guardian James Mitchell, a man who dedicated his life to standing perfectly still, never speaking, never moving, never showing emotion. For 8 years, he was the perfect royal guard at Buckingham Palace. Tourists photographed him thousands of times. Children tried to make him laugh. Adults tested his patience. Through it all, he remained a statue in red and black, a living symbol of British tradition. Until one ordinary Tuesday morning when everything changed. What started as a routine shift became the most talked-about incident in Royal Guard history. A single kick, caught on camera, would expose secrets that had been buried for decades. It would force the royal family to make decisions they never thought possible. And it would prove that sometimes, breaking the rules is the only way to save what truly matters. The world thought they knew what happened that day. The viral video showed only 30 seconds of chaos. But the real story, the story that unfolded behind palace walls and in secret meetings, is far more incredible than anyone imagined. This is that story. The complete, unfiltered truth about the day a royal guard's split-second decision changed the course of history. James Mitchell had always been different. While other children played football in the muddy fields behind their council estate homes, James stood perfectly still in his backyard, timing himself. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Eventually, he could stand motionless for an entire hour, his mind focused on a single point in the distance, his breathing so controlled that his chest barely moved. His mother, Sarah Mitchell, thought it was odd behavior for a 7-year-old. She would watch him through the kitchen window as she prepared dinner, wondering where this strange discipline came from. His father had left when James was 3, and there were no military men in their family. Yet somehow, this small boy had developed an almost supernatural ability to remain completely still. The other children called him weird. Teachers worried about his social development. But James didn't care. Something inside him craved order, precision, control. While chaos erupted around him in their rough neighborhood, he found peace in stillness. When James turned 18, he shocked everyone by announcing he wanted to join the household division. Not the regular army, not the police force that his guidance counselor had suggested, but the elite unit responsible for guarding the royal family. His mother laughed at first. Boys from their street didn't become royal guards. They became mechanics, shop clerks, or if they were lucky, local police officers. But James had been preparing for this moment his entire life, even if he didn't realize it. The selection process was brutal. Out of 3,000 applicants, only 47 would be chosen. The physical requirements alone eliminated most candidates. James had to run 5 miles in under 35 minutes while carrying full equipment. He had to demonstrate perfect marching technique. He had to prove he could stand motionless for 2 hours without wavering. The psychological evaluation was even more challenging. Military psychologists tested each candidate's ability to handle extreme boredom, constant scrutiny, and the pressure of representing the crown. They subjected applicants to hours of psychological stress, measuring their reactions to everything from loud noises to personal insults. James excelled at every test. While other candidates fidgeted during the long waiting periods, James stood perfectly still. When instructors screamed in his face, his expression never changed. When they made him stand in the rain for 6 hours without moving, he didn't even blink. Colonel Richard Pemberton, the commanding officer responsible for selecting new guards, had never seen anything like it. In 30 years of military service, he had encountered thousands of disciplined soldiers. But James Mitchell possessed something extraordinary. It wasn't just physical control, it was mental. The young man seemed capable of switching off his emotions entirely, becoming a living statue. The training that followed was unlike anything James had ever experienced. Every morning at 4:30, he and the other recruits were awakened by the harsh sound of a bugle. They had 15 minutes to dress in perfect uniform and report to the parade ground. Any mistake, no matter how small, resulted in punishment duty that could last until midnight. James learned the intricate details of royal protocol. He memorized the names and faces of every member of the royal family, their extended relatives, and hundreds of government officials. He studied architectural plans of every royal residence, learning every entrance, exit, and potential security concern. He practiced the precise movements required for different ceremonial duties, repeating each motion thousands of times until it became automatic. The physical conditioning was relentless. Guards had to be capable of standing motionless for hours while wearing heavy ceremonial uniforms and bearskin hats that weighed several pounds. They trained in all weather conditions, learning to ignore rain, snow, heat, and cold. James discovered muscles he never knew existed as instructors pushed his body to its absolute limits. But the mental training was the real challenge. Guards were taught to enter a meditative state while remaining completely alert. They had to be aware of every person, every movement, every potential threat around them while appearing totally disconnected from the world. It was a paradox that broke many recruits. James mastered it naturally. Instructors were amazed at his ability to stand motionless for 4 hours while simultaneously tracking the movements of dozens of tourists, identifying potential security risks, and remaining ready to react instantly to any threat. His situational awareness was extraordinary, as if he possessed some kind of supernatural perception. The ceremonial training was equally demanding. James learned the precise steps of the Queen's Guard March, the exact timing required for the changing of the guard ceremony, and the specific protocols for different royal events. Every movement had to be perfect, every angle precise. The British people expected their royal guards to represent centuries of military tradition, and there was no room for error. After 18 months of intensive training, James finally earned the right to wear the iconic red tunic and bearskin hat. The day he first stood guard at Buckingham Palace, his mother came to watch. She barely recognized the composed, motionless figure in the scarlet uniform. Her awkward, quiet son had transformed into something magnificent. For the first 3 years of his service, James was assigned to various royal residences. He guarded Windsor Castle during summer events, stood watch at the Tower of London during tourist season, and participated in state ceremonies at Westminster Abbey. Every assignment taught him something new about the weight of tradition he carried. The tourists fascinated him. From his motionless position, James observed thousands of people from around the world. Families on vacation, school children on educational trips, elderly couples fulfilling lifelong dreams of visiting London. They all wanted the same thing, a photograph with a royal guard. Most guards found the constant attention annoying. Children would try to make them laugh by pulling faces or telling jokes. Adults would attempt to engage them in conversation, sometimes becoming frustrated when the guards refused to respond. Some tourists were disrespectful, treating the guards like tourist attractions rather than professional soldiers. But James found the interactions intriguing. From behind his emotionless expression, he studied human behavior. He watched how different cultures approached authority figures, how children tested boundaries, how adults projected their own insecurities onto his silence. He began to understand that his role was about more than security. It was about representing something stable and permanent in an ever-changing world. The promotion to Buckingham Palace came in his 4th year. It was the highest honor for a royal guard, the ultimate recognition of his skill and dedication. Buckingham Palace guards were the most photographed soldiers in the world, the face of British tradition for millions of tourists annually. James's first day at the palace was overwhelming. The building itself was massive, containing 775 rooms connected by miles of corridors. The history contained within those walls was staggering. Kings and queens had lived, ruled, and died in those rooms for centuries. Prime ministers had made decisions that shaped world history in the palace's meeting rooms. Every stone seemed to whisper stories of power, tradition, and responsibility. His assigned position was outside the main gate, where thousands of tourists gathered daily. From 6 in the morning until 6 in the evening, James stood motionless while crowds pressed against the palace railings, cameras clicking constantly. The bearskin hat weighed 4 pounds and trapped heat like a furnace. The heavy wool uniform was sweltering in summer and freezing in winter. But James had trained for this. The other guards respected him quickly. Veterans who had served for decades were impressed by his natural ability and unwavering discipline. James never complained, never broke character, never showed the slightest sign of discomfort. He became known as the Statue among his fellow guards, a nickname that was both respectful and slightly envious. Sergeant Major Williams, a 20-year veteran who had guarded 3 different monarchs, took James under his wing. Williams taught him the unwritten rules of palace service, the subtle traditions that weren't covered in any manual. He explained how to handle difficult tourists, how to maintain awareness during long shifts, and, most importantly, how to balance the demands of duty with personal well-being. As months passed, James settled into the rhythm of palace life. Every day brought the same routine: morning inspection, assignment briefing, hours of motionless duty, evening debrief. The predictability was comforting. In a world of constant change, James had found his place as a guardian of tradition. The royal family occasionally passed by during his shifts. The Queen herself had walked past James dozens of times, though protocol prevented any interaction. Prince Charles often nodded slightly in acknowledgement, a gesture that meant everything to the guards. The younger royals sometimes smiled or waved discreetly, understanding that the guards appreciated recognition of their service. James's personal life was simple and disciplined. He lived in military quarters near the palace, spending his off-duty hours reading military history and maintaining his physical fitness. He had few close friends, preferring solitude and reflection. His mother visited occasionally, always amazed at how her son had found his calling in such an unusual profession. The media attention came gradually. James's perfect posture and unwavering discipline caught the attention of photographers and television crews. Pictures of him standing guard appeared in newspapers and magazines around the world. Tour guides began pointing him out specifically, telling groups that he was one of the finest guards in the service. But James remained humble and focused. He understood that the attention wasn't about him personally. It was about what he represented. He was a symbol of British tradition, a living connection to centuries of history. The red tunic he wore had been worn by thousands of guards before him, and would be worn by thousands after he was gone. By his 8th year of service, James had become something of a legend within the household division. Younger guards studied his techniques, trying to match his incredible stillness and awareness. Officers used him as an example during training sessions, pointing out his perfect posture and absolute discipline. Colonel Pemberton, now nearing retirement, often remarked that James Mitchell was the finest guard he had ever trained. In an era when young people seemed increasingly undisciplined and unfocused, James represented the best of British military tradition. He was proof that dedication, training, and natural ability could still produce something extraordinary. James himself felt grateful for the opportunity to serve. Every morning when he put on his uniform, he felt the weight of history and responsibility. He was protecting more than just buildings or people. He was guarding traditions that connected modern Britain to its ancient past. It was a privilege that he never took for granted. The morning that would change everything started like any other. James reported for duty at 5:30, underwent his daily uniform inspection, and received his assignment for the day. He would be stationed at the main palace gate from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. It was a Tuesday in late September, with pleasant weather and the usual crowds of tourists expected. As he took his position outside the palace gates, James performed his routine mental preparation. He cleared his mind of all distractions, focused his breathing, and entered the meditative state that would carry him through the next 8 hours. Around him, the first tourists of the day began to gather, cameras ready to capture their moment with a royal guard. James stood perfectly still, unaware that this would be the day that changed everything. The day when 8 years of perfect service would be tested in a way no training could have prepared him for. The day when a single moment would force him to choose between his oath of duty and something far more important. The morning started with an unusual tension that James couldn't quite identify. After 8 years of standing guard, he had developed an almost supernatural sense for when something was different. The air felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. Even the tourists seemed more agitated than usual, though he couldn't pinpoint why. At precisely 8 o'clock, James took his position at the main gate. The early morning shift was typically quieter, with fewer crowds and more serious sightseers rather than rowdy groups. He settled into his familiar stance, weight evenly distributed, eyes fixed on a point in the distance, breathing controlled and steady. The first unusual incident occurred at 9:15. A middle-aged man in an expensive suit approached the gate and began shouting at James in what sounded like Russian. The man's face was red with anger, and he gestured wildly while speaking in increasingly aggressive tones. Other guards had briefed James about occasional diplomatic incidents, but this seemed different, more personal somehow. Security personnel quickly intervened, escorting the agitated man away from the palace grounds. But something about the encounter unsettled James. In 8 years of service, he had never seen such raw hostility directed specifically at him. The man had stared directly into James's eyes while shouting, as if trying to provoke a reaction. The second incident happened just before 10 o'clock. A group of teenagers, clearly on some kind of school trip, began throwing small objects at James. Not rocks or anything dangerous, but crumpled paper and small coins. Their teachers seemed oblivious, busy taking photographs of the palace architecture. James remained motionless as protocol demanded, but he could sense the situation escalating. One of the teenagers, a boy about 16 years old, approached closer to the gate. He began making increasingly aggressive gestures, trying to get James to react. The boy's friends encouraged him, cheering each time he got away with another provocation. Palace security was busy with other matters, and James found himself essentially alone with the increasingly bold group. The boy picked up a small stone from the decorative landscaping near the gate. James's training had prepared him for this scenario. Remain motionless unless directly threatened with serious harm. Do not engage with provocative behavior. Trust security personnel to handle disruptions. But as the boy drew back his arm to throw the stone, James made a calculation. The stone was aimed not at James himself, but at an elderly woman who had moved into the trajectory while trying to photograph the palace. She was completely unaware of the danger, focused entirely on her camera's viewfinder. The boy was too young and excited to realize where his throw would land. For the first time in 8 years of service, James moved. He stepped forward exactly 1 pace and shifted his position just enough to intercept the stone with his shoulder. The impact was minor, but the movement was unmistakable. Every tourist within 50 feet turned to stare. Cameras began clicking furiously. The teenager stood frozen in shock, suddenly realizing what he had done. James immediately returned to his original position, his expression never changing. But the damage was done. A royal guard had moved while on duty. The incident would certainly be reported, investigated, and likely result in disciplinary action. 8 years of perfect service tainted by a single moment of human instinct. The boy who had thrown the stone seemed to understand the gravity of what had happened. His friends quickly pulled him away, and the group disappeared into the crowd of tourists. But dozens of people had witnessed the incident, and many had captured it on their phones. Security personnel arrived within minutes, having been alerted by other tourists. They questioned witnesses and reviewed security camera footage, but the consensus was clear. James had moved to protect a civilian, technically breaking protocol, but acting with obvious good intentions. The situation was unprecedented in recent memory. The morning continued with unusual tension. Word of the incident had spread among palace staff, and James could sense the increased attention from supervisors and fellow guards. Every movement was being scrutinized more carefully than usual. He remained at his post, maintaining perfect discipline despite knowing that his career was probably over. At 11:30, the third incident occurred, and this one changed everything. A woman in her 30s approached the palace gate with a young girl, perhaps 5 years old. The child was clearly excited to see a royal guard, pointing and whispering to her mother about James's tall hat and red uniform. It was a scene that played out hundreds of times every day, completely normal and innocent. But as they moved closer to the gate, James noticed something that made his blood run cold. The woman's behavior was wrong. Her grip on the child's hand was too tight, her movements too controlled. The little girl wasn't looking at the woman with the natural affection of a daughter for her mother. Instead, there was fear in the child's eyes. James had been trained to identify potential threats, but this was different. His years of observing human behavior had given him an instinct for reading people that went beyond standard security protocols. Everything about this situation screamed danger, but not the kind his training had prepared him for. The woman began positioning the child for photographs near the gate, but her movements were calculated, deliberate. She was scanning the area constantly, checking exits, and watching security personnel. The child remained silent, unusually subdued for someone her age visiting such an exciting place. Then James heard it, just barely audible above the crowd noise. The little girl whispered a single word, "Help." The word was spoken so softly that no one else could have heard it. But James, trained to notice every detail of his environment, caught it clearly. The child was looking directly at him when she said it, her eyes wide with fear that no 5-year-old should ever have to experience. Every instinct James had developed over 8 years of service told him that this child was in immediate danger. But his orders were absolute. Remain motionless, do not engage with civilians, trust security personnel to handle all situations. Moving again would end his career instantly. Breaking protocol twice in one day would result in court-martial and possible criminal charges. The woman noticed the child's behavior and jerked her hand roughly, pulling her away from the gate. The little girl stumbled and nearly fell, but the woman showed no concern for her welfare. Other tourists were too focused on taking pictures to notice the interaction. James faced an impossible choice: follow his orders and potentially allow a child to be harmed, or break his oath and risk everything he had worked for. 8 years of perfect service, a lifetime of discipline and dedication, weighed against the terrified whisper of a 5-year-old girl. The woman was moving toward the palace's main pedestrian exit, clearly intending to leave the area. In moments, they would disappear into the crowded London streets, and James would never know what happened to the child. Security personnel were occupied with other duties, unaware of the potential crisis unfolding. James made his decision. For the second time that day, he moved. But this time, it wasn't a subtle shift of position. James stepped forward, turned toward the woman and child, and spoke clearly and loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Ma'am, please stop where you are." The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. Every tourist within 100 feet turned to stare in shock. Royal guards simply did not speak while on duty. The breach of protocol was so unprecedented that people began filming immediately, sensing they were witnessing something historic. The woman froze, her face cycling through surprise, fear, and anger in rapid succession. The child looked up at James with a mixture of hope and terror, clearly understanding that something significant was happening but unsure what it meant. James continued speaking, his voice carrying the authority of 8 years of military training. "Security to the main gate immediately. Potential child welfare situation requires immediate attention." Palace security responded instantly to his call. Within 30 seconds, 4 armed officers had surrounded the woman and child. The woman began protesting loudly in accented English, claiming that James was harassing her and her daughter for no reason. But security personnel had been trained to trust the judgment of the guards, especially one with James's reputation. As security questioned the woman, the child began crying and speaking rapidly in what sounded like a mixture of English and another language. The woman tried to silence her, but the child continued talking, pointing at the woman and shaking her head frantically. One of the security officers, Sergeant Collins, spoke several languages from his previous service with international units. As he listened to the child's words, his expression grew increasingly serious. He immediately called for additional backup and child services personnel. The investigation that followed revealed James's instincts had been absolutely correct. The woman was not the child's mother, but part of a human trafficking ring that had been operating across Europe. The little girl had been taken from her family in Romania 3 weeks earlier and was being transported to a contact in Scotland when they had decided to play tourists in London to avoid suspicion. The child's whispered plea for help had been her first opportunity to communicate with someone she thought might be able to save her. Her captors had told her that if she tried to escape or ask for help, they would hurt her family back home. But something about James's steady, protective presence had given her the courage to risk those two whispered words. The rescue operation that followed James's intervention led to the arrest of 7 people connected to the trafficking ring. The investigation revealed that they had been operating for over 2 years, moving children across international borders for purposes that authorities preferred not to discuss publicly. The little girl, whose name was Elena, was eventually reunited with her family in Romania after weeks of careful rehabilitation. But James's heroic action came at an enormous personal cost. By speaking while on duty, he had violated one of the most fundamental rules of Royal Guard service. The fact that his intervention had saved a child's life complicated the situation, but it didn't change the reality that he had disobeyed direct orders. Within an hour of the incident, James was relieved of duty and escorted to a meeting with his commanding officers. Colonel Pemberton sat across from him in a sterile conference room, flanked by other high-ranking military officials and representatives from the royal household. The colonel's expression was unreadable as he reviewed the incident reports. James sat in perfect military posture, awaiting whatever judgment would come. He felt no regret about his actions, but he understood the gravity of what he had done. Guardian Mitchell, the colonel began slowly. In 8 years of exemplary service, you have never so much as blinked inappropriately while on duty. Today, you moved twice and spoke while at your post. Explain your actions. James responded with the same precision and clarity he had maintained throughout his military career. He described his observations of the suspicious woman, the child's plea for help, and his assessment that immediate intervention was necessary to prevent potential harm. He made no excuses and offered no justification beyond his professional judgment that a child was in danger. The room fell silent as James finished his explanation. The officials exchanged glances, clearly struggling with an unprecedented situation. A royal guard had blatantly violated protocol, but in doing so had potentially saved a child's life and exposed a major criminal operation. The meeting lasted for hours, with James answering detailed questions about his observations and decision-making process. Military investigators reviewed security footage, interviewed witnesses, and consulted with child services personnel who had examined Elena. As the afternoon wore on, James began to understand that his career as a royal guard was over. The rules were absolute for good reason, and exceptions could not be made regardless of the circumstances. He had chosen to prioritize a child's safety over his military oath, and while he would never regret that choice, he accepted the consequences. The preliminary decision was what James expected: immediate suspension pending full investigation, likely followed by discharge from service. His perfect record would be forever marked by this single day, though everyone involved acknowledged that his intentions had been honorable. As he was escorted from the palace grounds that evening, James looked back at the gate where he had stood guard for so many years. Other tourists were still gathering there, taking pictures with his replacement, completely unaware of the drama that had unfolded earlier. But, unknown to James, the story was far from over. The viral videos of his intervention were already spreading across social media, and the world was beginning to take notice of the royal guard who had risked everything to save a child. The royal family themselves were following the situation closely, and decisions were being made at the highest levels of government and monarchy. James Mitchell thought his story was ending, but it was actually just beginning. Within 6 hours of James's intervention, the first video appeared on social media. A teenage girl from Germany had captured the entire sequence on her smartphone, from the moment James first moved to intercept the stone, through his dramatic breach of protocol to stop the suspicious woman and child. She posted it on Instagram with the caption, "Royal Guard breaks silence to save little girl." The video went viral faster than anyone could have predicted. By midnight London time, it had been viewed over 2 million times across multiple platforms. The clip showed James's perfectly disciplined stance, his sudden movement to protect the elderly tourist, and then the unprecedented moment when he spoke and called for security to intervene with the woman and child. But viewers only saw 30 seconds of drama. They had no context for James's 8 years of perfect service, no understanding of the military protocols he had violated, and no knowledge of the human trafficking ring that his actions had exposed. All they saw was a brave guard risking his career to protect innocent people. Sarah Mitchell first learned about her son's situation when her neighbor knocked on her door at 7 in the morning, holding a printout of a news article. The headline read, "Hero Royal Guard Saves Trafficked Child." Sarah's hands shook as she read about James's actions, pride, and worry warring in her chest. She had raised him to do the right thing, but she also knew how much his military career meant to him. The media frenzy began in earnest on Wednesday morning. News crews gathered outside Buckingham Palace, trying to get statements from anyone connected to the Royal Guard. Reporters attempted to interview James's fellow guards, his commanding officers, and even track down his mother's address in their quest for exclusive information. The story captured public imagination in ways that surprised even veteran journalists. In an era of cynicism about authority figures and institutions, here was a man who had risked everything to save a child. The contrast between James's rigid military discipline and his human compassion struck a powerful chord with people around the world. Television news programs ran the story as their lead feature. Morning shows invited child safety experts to discuss human trafficking. Evening news broadcasts analyzed the protocols and traditions of the Royal Guard. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about whether James had done the right thing. The online response was overwhelmingly positive. Social media filled with messages of support for James, with hashtags like Save the Guard and Hero in Red trending globally. People shared their own stories of times when they had witnessed someone bending rules to help others. The narrative became bigger than just one guard's decision. It became a symbol of choosing humanity over bureaucracy. But, behind the scenes, the situation was far more complicated than the public realized. The Royal Guard operated under protocols that had been developed over centuries, each rule serving specific purposes related to security, tradition, and military discipline. James's actions, however well-intentioned, had created a precedent that could potentially undermine the entire system. Military officials found themselves in an impossible position. Disciplining James would appear heartless given that he had saved a child, but failing to enforce regulations would send a dangerous message that guards could decide for themselves when to follow orders. The situation required delicate handling at the highest levels of government and monarchy. Colonel Pemberton had been fielding calls from reporters, politicians, and royal household officials since dawn. The pressure to make a statement was intense, but any comment he made would be scrutinized and potentially misinterpreted by millions of people. The colonel had served his entire adult life in the military, but he had never faced anything like this media circus. Meanwhile, James remained in military quarters under what was officially called administrative leave, but felt very much like house arrest. He was forbidden from speaking to reporters, leaving the base, or even using personal electronic devices. The isolation was particularly difficult for someone accustomed to being surrounded by people and activity at the palace. The investigation into the human trafficking ring had revealed disturbing details about the network's operations. Elena, the 5-year-old girl James had helped save, was one of 12 children who had been rescued in coordinated raids across 3 countries. The woman with her at the palace had been carrying forged documents and had been planning to deliver Elena to contacts in Scotland that very evening. Detective Inspector Sarah Thompson, who was leading the trafficking investigation, had been trying to reach James for days. She needed his testimony about his observations and decision-making process, both for the criminal case and to understand how he had identified the danger when so many others had missed it. When she finally gained permission to interview James, Detective Thompson was struck by his calm professionalism. Even under enormous stress, he answered her questions with military precision and clarity. His observations about the woman's behavior had been remarkably accurate, demonstrating a level of situational awareness that impressed even veteran investigators. "How did you know?" she asked him during their 3-hour interview. "What specifically made you realize this child was in danger when hundreds of other people walked past without noticing anything unusual?" James considered the question carefully before answering. 8 years of watching people teaches you to read behavior patterns. The woman's movements were too controlled, too calculated. The child was too quiet, too compliant. Most 5-year-olds visiting the palace are excited, chattering constantly. This girl was silent and afraid. Detective Thompson documented every detail of James's observations. His testimony would be crucial for prosecuting the trafficking ring, but it also revealed something remarkable about his capabilities as a guard. His years of motionless observation had turned him into something like a human surveillance system, capable of detecting threats that others missed entirely. The story took another dramatic turn on Thursday when Elena's parents arrived in London. Romanian authorities had worked with British officials to arrange their travel, and the reunion was scheduled to take place at a secure location away from media attention. But somehow, reporters learned about the meeting and gathered outside the building where it was taking place. Photographs of Elena running into her mother's arms appeared on front pages around the world. The images were powerful and emotional, showing the human cost of trafficking and the importance of James's intervention. The little girl who had whispered help to a motionless guard was finally safe with her family. Elena's father, a carpenter named Mikhail, spoke briefly to reporters through a translator. His English was limited, but his gratitude was clear. The soldier in red coat, he saved my daughter. We never forget. Never forget. The family's statement added another layer to the growing narrative around James's actions. This wasn't just about military protocol or royal tradition. It was about a father getting his daughter back. The human element of the story resonated even more powerfully than the initial dramatic video. Public pressure for James's reinstatement grew throughout the week. Online petitions garnered hundreds of thousands of signatures. Letters poured into Buckingham Palace, Downing Street, and military headquarters demanding that the hero guard be honored rather than punished. Several members of parliament raised questions about the case during parliamentary sessions. The royal family themselves were following the situation closely, though they maintained public silence on the matter. Palace insiders reported that there had been several high-level meetings about James's case, with different family members offering different perspectives on how to handle the unprecedented situation. Prince William, himself a military veteran, was reportedly sympathetic to James's position. He understood the weight of military protocol, but also appreciated the split-second decisions that service members sometimes had to make in challenging situations. The prince had faced similar dilemmas during his own service, though never under such public scrutiny. The Queen, as always, was more cautious about setting precedents that could affect long-standing traditions. She recognized James's heroism, but worried about the implications of appearing to endorse violations of royal protocol. Her position was particularly delicate given her role as head of the armed forces and guardian of constitutional traditions. International attention added another dimension to the crisis. The story had been covered by news organizations in dozens of countries, many of which used it as an opportunity to examine their own approaches to child trafficking and protection. James had become an inadvertent symbol of moral courage that transcended national boundaries. Child safety organizations seized on the case to raise awareness about trafficking. They pointed out that Elena's rescue had only been possible because someone had been trained to notice subtle signs of distress and willing to act on those observations. The case became a teaching tool for recognizing potential trafficking situations in everyday settings. James remained largely unaware of the global attention his actions had generated. Military officials had deliberately kept him isolated from media coverage, believing it would help him maintain perspective and avoid additional stress. He spent his days reading, exercising, and reflecting on the events that had changed his life so dramatically. But isolation also meant uncertainty. James had no idea whether he would face criminal charges, military court-martial, or simple discharge from service. The waiting was perhaps worse than any punishment would have been. He had dedicated his life to serving something greater than himself, and now that service was in jeopardy. His mother visited when she could, though media attention made even these meetings difficult. Sarah Mitchell had always been proud of her son's military service, but she struggled to understand the complexities of his current situation. She wanted to support him while also respecting the institutional structures he had sworn to serve. During one visit, she asked him directly whether he regretted his actions. James's answer came without hesitation. Never. If I had to do it again, I would make the same choice. Some things are more important than rules. His response revealed something fundamental about James's character that 8 years of rigid discipline hadn't changed. Beneath the perfect military bearing was a man guided by moral principles that went deeper than any protocol or regulation. He had joined the royal guard to serve and protect, and that's exactly what he had done. By Friday, pressure for a resolution had reached critical levels. The story dominated news cycles, social media feeds, and political discussions. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about what should happen to James Mitchell. The royal family and military leadership knew they had to make a decision.